Ready? All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here again with you today. I'm Alan White. As Larry said, I have a PhD in chemistry from Harvard, and I worked at Eastman for 30 years, not surprisingly, I guess, in this area. I actually grew up in this area, and I have a bunch of patents and a bunch of publications, and so, what I want you to know, most of all, is that I am a follower of Christ, okay? And that all the things that I've seen in all the years that I've studied science are consistent with what the Bible says. And that's my message to you today is that, they'll say, well, you can't be a scientist and a follower of Christ at the same time, or you can't be a scientist and believe what the Bible says. Well, that's not true. And so I just want to make sure that you understand that. And we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the origin of life, okay? The origin of life. And really, could life have evolved by chance? You won't be too surprised to hear me say that the Bible says no, that God created everything in the beginning. He created all in 6 days, rested on the seventh day. He created life, we see, on day 5 mostly, and day 6, okay, he created the flying creatures, the swimming creatures, the creatures that are on the earth. And so it doesn't say that it evolved by chance at all. And so we're going to talk about in detail how that is. But what I want to tell you is this, that you may be surprised at, is that the scientific data say no. The scientific data say that we weren't evolved either, and that's what I want to show you. Now the scientists still believe that we are evolved by chance, even though the data don't support that. So they have great faith that we were evolved by chance, and as you're going to see from the data I'm going to show you today, they need a great faith to believe that life evolved by chance, okay? And you well know how complicated your bodies are and how unlikely it is that life could evolve by chance. But if you don't get anything else out of the talk today, I want you to make sure that you understand that life is a precious gift from God, okay? Life is a precious gift from God. Matter of fact, I want you to think about life for a minute as I'm getting started here and see if you can think of a definition of life. Okay, that's harder than you may think to come up with a definition of life, and we're going to talk about that more as I get into the middle of the talk. But just think about, how would you define life? It's not so easy. So how did life begin? I'm going to talk about it in two choices. Either life came about by a supernatural process, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, believe that in this room today. Supernatural process by the God of the Bible, or by a natural process. And what I mean by a natural process, what the scientists mean, is that somehow simple chemicals, now they don't know how the simple chemicals got here, okay, but they say the simple chemicals somehow organized themselves into highly specific, complex molecules, and voila, life came about. Okay, simple life. Now, I'm not going to talk about evolution so much today. I'm sure other speakers have and will, but I'm not going to focus on that so much. But I'm going to focus on, how did simple chemicals come to life? Okay, and you'll see that really is impossible. Okay, and so you are not an accident. You were in the mind of God long before even the world was created. Okay. Now, the other thing that I want to help you understand the importance of this topic today is that what you believe about the origin of life has a lot to do with how you value life. Okay? If you believe that life is just a random bunch of chemicals coming together, then you're going to value life differently than if you believe it's a precious gift from God, right? And so if you look at this, what is our society looking at this today and saying? Well, that's just a random bunch of chemicals come together and we're not sure it's life, where it's life yet or not, okay? And so, but if you look at it as a precious gift from God, then you were in God's mind even way before you were conceived, okay? And so it seems to me that it makes good sense that life from a human standpoint begins at conception, when the egg and the sperm come together and the DNA are fused and set. Presumably the spirit goes in at the same time. And so that life, to me, has the same value as any of us in this room today, okay? But that's not where our society is today, right? But I want you to understand that part of that basis of what they believe is because of what they believe about how we got here, okay? And so it helps us understand why they are where they are, okay? And so not only that end of life, but the end of life that most of us are closer to, okay, is what is the value of this life? Okay, our society is putting less value on this life now, too. Okay, Jean was 100. She's now passed away. She was 121. Okay, 121. That's what they say. I think the oldest person now is around 117, I think, okay? Now, most of us, I'm not sure we even want to make it that far, okay? But she was 120. But what you'll probably be surprised to learn is that I think it's 9 states now, euthanasia is legal in 9 states in the United States, okay? And so that's what I want you to understand is what you believe about how we got here, how life began. What you believe about that determines how you value life, all right? And so again, some earlier speakers may have put up things like this. Your worldview, how you look at this world, matters, okay? And so I want you to look at 2 different people. The man on the left, a scientist, he's looking at these bones in the middle. These are bones of Lucy. You probably have heard of Lucy, right? These bones are some of the best evidence that the scientists have of an ape man, or in this case, an ape woman, okay? But you can see from these bones, the evidence is not very strong. I mean, what can you tell about these bones? Is that a human or an ape or somewhere in the middle? It's really hard to tell, but this man on the left, because of his worldview, because he has an evolutionary worldview, he says, well, that looks like an ape man to me, okay? But the woman on the right looks at these same bones, and she has a biblical belief, and she looks at this and says, well, those are just bones of an extinct ape, okay? Matter of fact, I hear some of you are going to the Ark and the museum. Is that right? Okay, great. When you get to the museum, you'll be able to see an exhibit there that David Minton did, and he has holographic projections where he projects some of these bones onto an ape-like creature like is on your right up here, and he shows how they fit incredibly well. With that, and these bones of Lucy are just the bones of an extinct ape, okay? And so, but you'll see the evidence of that in the Creation Museum, and I encourage you to look at that. David was a brilliant man. And so your worldview matters. When you're looking at things like this where the evidence is not clear, your worldview matters. There really are 2 kinds of science, okay? There really are 2 kinds of science, and I want to help you understand that. Some of the previous speakers may have talked about this some, but, whoops, there we go. There really are 2 kinds of science. I did experimental science at Eastman for 30 years, okay? And so I'd go in the laboratory and make molecules. I made a lot of plastics, but what did I do? I did experiments, I made observations, I repeated experiments, I did it all in the present. And so by experimental science, people have discovered new pharmaceuticals, People have discovered new elementary physics particles like the Higgs boson that they believe now is real. They have some evidence for that now. Okay, and so that is what experimental science is. It's in the present, it's observable and repeatable. Okay, and so we have pretty good confidence of what we've discovered. Now, what we're going to talk about today, the origin of life, is not experimental science, all right? It's what I'm going to call historical science, all right? And so why is that? Well, what kind of sounds did a T-Rex make, okay? Anybody know? Anybody? No, nobody's heard of T-Rex yet? Okay, well, you've heard them on the movies, right? In the movies, right? But did they know what the sound of T-Rex? Of course not. They didn't know. Now, they estimated it based on the shape of the head of a T-Rex. Okay, they actually did try to do that. And so that's what I want to make sure you understand. What we're talking about today is not as well-founded as experimental science is. There's more interpretation. There's less certainty that the results that we have are sure. And so, can we know for sure how life began? Were any of us there? Well, no, none of us were there. Okay, only God, and so only He really knows for sure. And we know what His Word says, and we trust that. Okay, but that's what I want you to understand, is that historical science isn't as certain as experimental science, but many secular scientists talk about it as if it is. Okay, they talk about this historical science as if it has the same certainty as experimental science, and I want you to understand that it doesn't. Okay, and so one other thing: why are we even able to study science? Okay, why does it even make sense to study science? There's several things that have to be true about this world for it to make sense to study science. Our world needs to be consistent. Come back here. Needs to be consistent, orderly, and logical. Sorry about that. Consistent, orderly, and logical. If I did an experiment on Monday and got a certain result, and then I did an experiment on Tuesday and got a different result, it wouldn't make any sense to study science, right? If I couldn't explain my results, if it weren't an orderly system, again, it wouldn't make any sense. Why would I study science if I can't explain anything? Okay, and if I can't look at my experimental data and logically conclude one thing or another, if logic isn't a part of the world, then again, it doesn't make sense to study science. And so if we look at this and we look at the man on the left who stands on God's truth, and he looks at the world as consistent, orderly, and logical, and he says, well, okay, God is consistent, orderly, and logical. That makes sense, okay? But if you look at the man on the right and he says, well, everything came about by accident, okay? Everything is just a random accident. Does that fit with consistent, orderly, and logical? Doesn't fit, does it? And so I want to illustrate this with this quote. This is from a Harvard professor of astronomy. He's actually head of the department. He's being interviewed by New Yorker magazine, a very liberal publication, of course, and Harvard, a very liberal place where I was. He said this to an interview. He said, I was secular to start with. I'm not religious. But he says, I am struck by the order we find in the universe, by the regularity, by the existence of the laws of nature. That is something I'm always in awe of, he says. How the laws of nature we find here on earth seem to apply all the way out to the edge of the universe. Okay? He sees an orderly universe all the way out to the edge of the universe. He said, that's quite remarkable. And he goes on, he says, the universe could have been very chaotic and disorganized, but it obeys a set of laws much better than people obey a set of laws here, he says. And then he goes on, my work as a scientist is purely based on evidence and rational thinking, that's all. Okay? Do you see the inconsistency there? Okay? What he says was this universe could have been, and based on his worldview, should have been disorganized and chaotic. Okay? But that's not what we see. We see it something totally different. And so in his mind, his worldview really doesn't fit with what he sees, but he doesn't see the conflict. Okay? And so I hope you do. And so I'm going to contrast these two worldviews now, a biblical worldview and a secular worldview. And I want to start with a biblical worldview. I contend that the Bible says that we have value. Genesis 1:26 said, and then God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. You were made in the image of God. Okay? Your value comes from God. Okay? We are valuable to him. We were made in his likeness. That's an awesome thing to think about. And you can spend years thinking about that because it's hard to really fully comprehend what that means to be made in God's image. But we are made in God's image, and therefore we have value. Ephesians 2:10 says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for what? For good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Okay, and so if you've got an evolutionary worldview, do you have a purpose? We'll talk about that in a minute, but where would it come from? Okay, God has given us a purpose, and hopefully you're aware of that and following in the footsteps that he has laid out for you. Okay, and so we have value, we have purpose, and a morality. Jeremiah 31:33, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my law within them and I will write them on my heart. Okay, now it's not literally written on your heart, okay? But in a figurative sense, it really is. Okay, I had a man ask me after the talk one time, you know that's really not written on your heart, right? You couldn't actually see that. I said, yeah, I know that. Okay, but he actually believed that I meant that. Okay, and so God has written his law on our hearts. Okay, we know what we ought to do. We know right from wrong. And of course, reading the Bible helps us understand that even better, but internally we know right from wrong. And Psalm 139 says, you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I'm going to show you some things today that if you haven't seen them before are going to amaze you about how you were knit together, literally knit together in your mother's womb. Okay, and so on with the biblical then. The Bible says, I hope you won't mind, there are a couple of grandchildren pictures in here. Okay, so this is my daughter, Kristen, and her husband, Joe, and their two children. This was several years ago. Okay, but I do want to make the point that the Bible says that life comes from life. Okay, and let's look at two verses. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so, he gave to the Son also to have life in himself. John 5:26, okay. So where did life begin? Life began with God, okay. God the Father and God the Son. And then the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty, what? Gives me life. Job 33:4, okay. And so life comes just the way that life went from my wife and I into our daughter, and from our daughter and her husband into our grandchildren. Life comes from life. Okay? And so, but that's what the Bible says. That's also what science says. Okay? If you remember Louis Pasteur's experiments, again, my youngest son, his wife, and one of my grandchildren there. But Louis Pasteur in the 1850s did experiments that showed that people thought that life came just by accident, but he showed that life comes from life. And it's called, even they have a word for it, it's called biogenesis, okay? And so life, even scientific experiments say life comes from life. This is what we observe. Isn't that what we observe in the world every day? Okay. Cats make more cats, right? Oak trees make more oak trees, right? People make more people. That's the way that life works. Life comes from life. Evolution requires abiogenesis, that life comes from non-living things, okay? And that's totally different. That's what the scientists like to believe, okay? So that's the biblical view. Let's look at the secular view of life. Secular view says you are a random collection of atoms assembled by chance. Okay, how does that make you feel out there? You're a random collection of atoms by chance. Makes you feel good, doesn't it? Okay, maybe not. Okay, it doesn't make me feel very good, I can tell you. You decide if you have a purpose, and you decide what that purpose is. If you're a random bunch of atoms, then you decide what the purpose is, right? Who else is there to decide? And then there's no external standard by which you determine right and wrong. And so people get together and decide what's right and wrong, and a lot of different people make different decisions about what's right and wrong, okay? And so that's unclear. And then in a biblical worldview, death is the end, okay? We go back and the worms eat us, right, or something, whatever. And so death is the end in a secular worldview. Very, very different from a biblical worldview. And not very appealing from my perspective. Another thing I want to make sure that you're understanding, and I imagine you are, but let me just give you some statistics here. Life has become less valuable to those in our society. Suicide rates have increased almost 30% in the last 18 years. Now, this is from 2000 to 2018. You believe that? 30% in the last 18 years. That to me is astounding. But what does it indicate? It indicates how people value life, right? It indicates how people value life. Abortions are now allowed in New York State even up to the point of birth, okay? It's chilling, isn't it? Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, I didn't know that. So the lady in the back says they're even, how many days? 28 days, okay. Now it's appalling. The lady in the back, for those that didn't hear, said that in California you're allowed even after 28 days after birth, okay. Now, that's the natural progression of things, though. Think about that. If you have a secular worldview, where are you going to go? You're going to go more and more crazy from our perspective, right? Okay, and to take a life after birth. But that was even proposed by people long ago, okay? And now, apparently, it's coming true. It's incredibly scary to me. And the law is now permitting euthanasia on the rise. 9 states now permit euthanasia, permit assisted suicide, if you will. And so that has changed. So the value of life at the end of life is changing, too. Well, I won't go there. Let me go on. So how many of you thought about it, a definition of life, okay? So the scientists, and I'm talking about kind of a scientific definition, the scientists had a good deal of trouble doing this. This is the best definition I could find in the scientific literature. Life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution, okay? Now that makes you feel good, doesn't it? Okay. You probably didn't know that, didn't you? That you are capable of Darwinian evolution. Well, that's purely wrong, of course, but that is the NASA definition. As somebody was talking to me about before, he said, well, they're out there looking for life all over the universe. Okay. Why is that? Well, they believe if they find life somewhere else, that proves that evolution is true, because what they believe is that anywhere the conditions are right, evolution is going to happen, okay? Now, the only way there's life anywhere else except on this earth is that God created it, okay? And I'm going to show you even more evidence as we go along. But no matter where in the universe you are, you're not going to evolve life. It makes no sense, okay? And so what the scientists have done, since they couldn't come up with a very good definition, okay, at least from my perspective, what they've decided to do is describe what living things can do, okay? And that's easier easier than trying to come up with a definition. And so what can your bodies do? What can living things do? They can convert food into energy. A lot of different kinds of foods. Your body is able to handle a lot of different kinds of food and convert it to energy, okay? Metabolism, incredibly complicated process, really, but one that works very well. I got a biochemistry text, a college-level biochemistry text, and this is one of the first things it talked about. Homeostasis, okay? The control of your body, how your body controls everything it does. Now think about that for a minute. Would you expect a random process to produce a living thing that would control everything it does? Okay? Your body controls its temperature in a very narrow range. Your body controls the ion concentrations inside and outside your cell. It controls them at different levels so that you can live. If those levels get off track, you don't survive. If the pH, the acidity of your blood, has to be somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45, in a 1/10 of a pH unit, if your blood is outside that pH, you don't survive. Your entire body is controlled by level after level after level of control systems, okay? And the biologists don't see any problem with that. They say, well, of course that could have evolved. That makes no sense in the world. How could you evolve control systems on top of control systems on top of control systems? But that's what your body does. It controls essentially everything about how your body works. Living things respond to stimuli. Okay, again, a very complicated thing. Growing and developing. I want you to think about this for a minute. Think about a baby in the womb developing, or even think about your children developing when they're young. How is it that your bones and your muscles grow to where they stay the same length and fit together? Have you ever thought about that? How in the world does a body grow and maintain that? I mean, I know that in some years that your children struggled a bit because that process didn't work perfectly, okay, and that their bones or their muscles, one of the others, grew a little bit and they were had some cramping or whatever like that. But for the most part, your bones and your muscles and your nerves and all the other things that are connected in your body, they all grow together, okay, and it all works out. That is not an accident, okay, that's an incredible design. And so bodies grow and develop. But the most complicated thing that living things do is reproduce. Okay, I want you to think about that for a minute. Can you make anything that can reproduce? Think about that for a minute. Can you intentionally make anything that can reproduce itself? Okay. Now we can make car factories, and those car factories make what? They make cars. They don't make other car factories. Okay? I want you to think about that. I challenge you to think about, can you make anything? I'm not talking about living things. God did that, okay? But I'm talking about something you could make that could make more of itself. We can't do it. We can't do it intentionally, but the scientists believe it happened by accident. Okay, we can't even do it intentionally, but they believe. And I'm going to show you more about reproduction later. But just one other thing, each of these systems require different, highly complex molecular systems, and guess what? They all have to work together, because if they don't work together, you don't live. And so you have an incredible number of highly complex molecular systems all working together. So that's what living things can do. And here's what the secular scientists say. This is how it began. Secular scientists believe that the life began on the earth about 3.8 billion years ago. They believe the earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and that life began about 3.8 billion years ago. Okay? The claim is that life must have begun with a molecule that's simple enough to have been formed from the simple chemicals that was on the earth, but that chemical that was made from those simple chemicals is able to reproduce itself. Okay? Now, I don't know about you. I mean, I worked in the laboratory at Eastman for a long time. I didn't see anything make itself. Okay? And matter of fact, making chemicals in the laboratory is pretty hard. Okay? Trying to make what you want to make. Okay? It doesn't happen by accident, and it certainly doesn't reproduce. There's no evidence anywhere that simple chemicals reproduce. But that's what secular science say. This is what has to happen for life to come from chemicals. Okay? And there's no known molecule that comes anywhere close to doing that. Okay? But that's what they believe. Now here is the fascinating thing that I found, that here's a scientist actually speaking. This is pretty unusual. I found this quote. This was in a very obscure place. This is George Whitesides. He's a famous Harvard professor of organic chemistry. He's studied origin of life for years. He knows more organic chemistry than I would ever know. Okay, he studied the origin of life for years and years and years at a very high level at Harvard. And here's what George Whiteside said. He said, most chemists believe, as I do, and I'm not most chemists, okay, but most chemists believe, as I do, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules on the prebiotic earth. He's talking about the early earth. How? Here's what George Whiteside says. I have no idea. Okay? He says, I have no idea. Based on all the chemistry that I know, it seems astonishingly improbable that life could have come by chance. But what does he have? Okay? He has great faith, right? He has great faith that life came from simple chemicals. What's that faith based on? Well, I could speculate that he doesn't want to believe that there's a God. Okay? And if you don't want to believe there's a God, then what are you left with? Well, you're left with simple dead chemicals coming to life, as improbable as that might seem. But you don't often find scientists that speak this candidly about this. But I was able to find this quote, and I was incredibly surprised that he would say that. Okay, so even the scientists have great faith here and not a lot of evidence. You may have seen these experiments or at least talked about, where Stanley Miller put electrical spark inside of some chemicals and put them around, and he said, well, I made some chemicals that are like your body is made of, like amino acids. We're going to talk about amino acids in a minute. And yes, he did make a few amino acids, but not of the kind that you need for making the body. And I'll talk about that. But even if he had, that doesn't make a living thing. He just made some of the simplest chemicals that you're made of. I like to think about it this way, okay, that if you put enough, they believe that if you put enough energy into something, you can bring something that's dead to life. Okay, I don't know whether y'all remember Young Frankenstein or not, but this is a picture from the Young Frankenstein. But they believe that all you got to do is put enough energy into something and it'll come alive. Is that true? Well, of course not. You need incredibly complex molecular machines inside of your body, which you have, which I'm going to show you, which are able to bring your body to life in that sense. But without those incredibly complex machines, just energy isn't going to do anything but burn up this poor guy or whatever that's on the table, right? And so Frankenstein doesn't really work, all right? And it wasn't where did life begin? They say, well, maybe it was at the bottom of the ocean with one of these black smokers, okay? Well, no. Maybe it was in Antarctica in the ice. You know, they wanted enough energy here, but they know that if they get too much energy that the chemicals will degrade. And so they say, well, maybe in Antarctica in the ice, there's not enough energy. And so I was fascinated to find that this is where a lot of the scientists are going now. Panspermia. Now, I don't know whether you know what that word means or not, but that means that life came from another planet to Earth. Okay, now let's think about that for a minute. Okay, so somehow life formed on another planet. Okay, now how'd that happen? They're not too sure about how that happened. Okay, but at least you have a longer time, they believe, to do it. And so they believe that, well, life happened there, and somehow got a ride on an asteroid, all right, somehow traveled through deep, dark, cold space, and then traveled through our atmosphere at a high temperature, survived all that, came to Earth, and seeded life here on Earth. Now that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Okay, well, it doesn't make any sense to me, but the scientists, it gives you an idea of how desperate they are to try to explain how life began, all right? And so what I couldn't believe is that they published a scientific paper with 33 different authors on it. By the way, if there are 33 different authors on a paper, you know that they're just trying to get credit for something or show that they believe in something, because 33 people didn't work on this, okay? And so, but what they're saying is they believe that the earth is being constantly bombarded with life, such as space-hardy bacteria, viruses, more complex eukaryotic cells like you're made of, and fertilized eggs and seeds. Okay, and so that's the latest theory now, that life came from outer space, okay, and that it traveled through space somehow, got here, and seeded life on this planet. Well, again, you can see how desperate they are to do that. And here, let me just try to help you see and understand what would have to happen. If you started with simple chemicals like ammonia and water and acetic acid and some other simple chemicals, what do you have to make in order to make life? Well, you have to make something like this, okay? This is, at the top is hemoglobin, at the bottom is DNA, okay? So you need an incredible amount of information to build your body, and that information, most of it, is buried in your DNA. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about DNA in a little while. Okay, and so, but incredibly specific complex structure. You can make some complicated molecules by accident, but you can't make them specific, okay? And so you need to make specific things like this. And yes, these atoms are so small. I mean, that hemoglobin has, as I'll show you in a little bit, almost 600 amino acids in it. Okay, and so they had to put it up small just so you could see the whole thing. But somehow these simple chemicals are supposed to have made complex things like this, and that they work together. Okay, and then somehow these complex chemicals, even if you could make those, you have to still make something that's alive. Okay, and so this is the simplest living thing that we know, a simple bacterium, but would you all label that as simple? What do you think? That looks incredibly complex to me, right? So even if you could make these highly complex molecules, they're not going to work together and unless you have some way of putting this cell structure together. Even if you took that cell structure and you put it in a blender and separated all the parts, and you left it in that, you turned the blender off and just left it, that cell will not reform. Okay, even if you have all the parts that you need, the cell won't reform. Okay, and so to believe that you could take simple chemicals, that they'd be specifically incredibly complex and work together, is just incredibly hard for me to believe. But that's what they do. And the funny thing is, I got that same biochemistry textbook out, and I looked at it, and they spent about 6 or 8 pages, okay, in the book, trying to help you understand how you could, what happens. You need, as I said, you need 2 kinds of really incredibly complex molecules. You need something that has the information, like DNA, and you need something structural to build your body out of, right? And so you need DNA and you need proteins to do that. And so, and the biologists and biochemists all understand this. And they know that even trying to propose that one of these things came about by accident is incredibly unlikely. And now they know that they need to propose that 2 of them came about. But the problem is, and I've summarized 6 or 8 pages here, is it comes down to this. It takes DNA to make a protein, and it takes protein to make DNA. Okay? Chicken and the egg problem, right? It takes DNA to make protein, but it takes protein to make DNA, so where do you start? Okay? They have nowhere to start. Okay? And they know it. And they say it's a They say it's a conundrum. It's a problem that they can't really figure out, and they can't. But it's in the textbook, and they try to obfuscate it. They try to confuse people in the book by making it 6 or 8 pages. But this is basically where you come out. So anyway, let me show you just a little bit about what your body is made of. This is my kids' toys, but it shows you a little bit about what a section of a protein might look like, okay? Proteins are made of different amino acids there. These are represented by the different colors. And they're represented, and they're connected in differing ways here, as you can see. Your body is made of, they're long chains. Most of the functional proteins in your body have several hundred amino acids. One of these simple structures connected here. They have about several hundred of these connected together in specific ways. There are 20 different amino acids in your body, 20 different ones, okay? And so and to make a functional protein, those have to be in exactly the right order, okay? And not only do they have to be in exactly the right order, they have to be folded into exactly the right shape. Okay, so while this protein would be functional, I broke my molecules. Okay, if you do that, if you change the shape of it at all, it's no longer functional. So even if you have the right, thank you, sir. Even if you have the right order of the molecules, if you don't have them folded in the right way, they don't work. Okay, and so your body is incredibly complicated in that regard. And I want you to just think about it for just a minute. What are the chances of making a protein by accident? Okay, let's give them the fact that you've got the amino acids to begin with. It's incredibly unlikely, but let's say you had the amino acids to begin with. What are the chances of making a protein by accident? Well, the chances of getting the first 20 amino acids right is this number here at the bottom, that you see at the bottom of the slide there, okay? I don't even know what that number is. It's a big number, okay? That's the chance of getting the first 20 amino acids right. And what do we have to do? We have to get several hundred correct to have one of them done. Okay, so the chance of getting hemoglobin correct, it has 575 amino acids, so the chance of getting hemoglobin correct is 20 raised to the 575th power, which is roughly this number here. Okay? Now, you don't need to count the zeros. There are about 780 zeros after that one. Okay? 780 zeros. You know how many molecules there are in the universe? I mean, the atoms in the universe? There's like 1 followed by 80 zeros. That's how many atoms there are in the universe. Okay, so this is 1 followed by 780 zeros. This is the chance of making one protein correctly. All right, we need to make about 20,000 proteins correctly. Okay, what do you think the chances of that are? Okay, so the chances of you having come about by accident are 0. Okay, and so it's 1 in 7 with 780 zeros after it. Okay, and so there is no chance that you came about by accident. Okay. There's one other thing that I didn't tell you about the amino acids. These amino acids, 19 of the 20 amino acids come in 2 different forms. They come in a left-handed form and a right-handed form. You ever heard that before? Okay, so they come in a left-handed form and a right-handed form. What does that mean? Well, this is my representation of amino acid. And you'd think the same atoms are here, and the same bonds are here, but they're connected in a slightly different way. So let me see if I can put these in the same space. Well, I can match up the yellow one and the orange one and the red one, but the brown one and the blue one are opposite, okay? And so they're not exactly the same. It's just like your right hand and your left hand. Is your right hand exactly the same as your left hand? Well, can you put your right hand in your left glove? Okay, not so easy, is it? Okay, and so these molecules are essentially exactly the same, except that spatially they're not quite exactly the same. They have all the same physical properties. Okay, this molecule has the same physical properties as this molecule, except for one tiny point. And so, what do we do with that? And so, if your body was made by a random process, what would you expect? If I went in the laboratory today and made an amino acid, I would make 50% of these and 50% of these, okay? Because it's random, okay? I'd make 50% of these and 50% of these. Well, what do you think your body's made of, okay? Your body is actually, okay, the natural situation would be 50-50. It turns out that every amino acid in your body is left-handed, okay? Every one in your body is left-handed. If they weren't, they wouldn't be in the right shape, okay? They have to be in exactly the right shape. And if you have a right-handed amino acid, it changes the shape of your protein dramatically. If you had one, you might be okay, but if you had two, even two out of several hundred, the shape of the protein is going to be so different that it won't work. Okay? And so, does that sound random to you? That every one of those amino acids is left-handed. And it turns out that your DNA has a molecule in it that has a handedness to it too. It could be either left-handed or right-handed. It turns out that the sugar in your DNAs are all right-handed because they have to be exactly the right shape too. Okay, and so scientists don't even know how to do this in the laboratory. If you told me I had to go in the laboratory and make all left-handed amino acids and I couldn't start with something that's already left-handed, I couldn't do it. Okay? Scientists don't even know how to do it, but they're confident that this all happened by accident. Okay? All right. So proteins wouldn't have formed naturally. So natural processes wouldn't explain how proteins are made. They don't explain how the proteins get folded into the right shape. They're actually enzymes that actually fold the proteins into the right shape. And they don't explain, scientists can't explain left-handed amino acids, but they try. All righty, let's see what time we got here. Okay, very good. Let me show you a DNA structure for a minute. As I was telling you, your DNA is where the information to make your body is held, most of it. And what it is a string of letters, actually two strings of letters, wound around each other into a helix. You've probably heard of a helix, right? And so these are wound around each other, and the two strands are paired together. They're bonded with weak bonds, but there are a lot of bonds, and so those two strands are held together. The thing, let me make sure I tell you, is that one strand is going this way, and the other strand is headed in the other direction, okay? But they're bonded together, all right? And so, and you have, how many letters do you have in your DNA? Well, you have a mere 3 billion letters in your DNA. And most of us in this room have almost the same structure, but we have tiny differences between us, okay, that make the differences of how we look different and all that, okay? And so that's the DNA structure. DNA is like a language. It's like in the beginning was the Word. It's a language. In English, we have 27 characters. In DNA, we have 4 different characters, A, C, T, and G. Excuse me. And those letters code for the different amino acids. Okay? And so if you take 3 letters, each 3 letters codes for one amino acid. Okay? And so that's how that works. And I'll show you how that ends up working in a minute. A, C, T, and G. Okay. And so again, the DNA is like a code or a language. Okay. Now, do codes and languages come about by accident? Oh, I don't think so. Okay. They're how we communicate. It takes intelligence to make a code. But what does Werner Getz say from Germany? He said, there's no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate itself in matter. Okay? What I want you to think about is, have you ever seen something that got more complicated by itself, by chance? Okay? Have you ever seen anything? Now, things break down, right? We see that all the time. I see that in my body all the time, okay? Things break down, we see that everywhere, but do things get more complicated by themselves? No, it takes intelligence to make something complicated, okay? And that's what Werner Getz is saying here, is that things don't get more complicated by chance. But that's what has to happen if evolution is true, right? That information had to come from somewhere, right? And where did the information come from? Well, it came from an all-powerful, all-knowing God. That's what has to be the source of the information. But there's no other source of information possible. It had to be a God. It had to be an all-knowing God to do that. And so, what I'm going to show you here is how the body takes the information from the DNA and makes a protein. Here is the information coming out of that was the nucleus. This is a ribosome. This is a little molecular machine. This is the RNA, which has come from the DNA in the nucleus of your cell. And here's the amino acid there coming out of that ribosome. Okay? So we'll look at it in more detail here. Again, here is the information from the RNA. That's the ribosome there. The information is being fed into the ribosome 3 units at a time. Okay? These little things are carrying the amino acids. In one end, they match up with the DNA, and the other end puts the amino acid in the next step. Okay? And so what you're seeing here is that. There it is, opened up. Each of these green things match up with 3 things here, and then they put that amino acid in the next step. And that's how your amino acid sequence is right every time. The information is read directly from the DNA. It's translated by these green molecules, translated in the sense that they take the information, they get the right amino acid, and they put the next amino acid in the sequence. What do you think? I'm sure that came about by chance, right? Is that incredible or what? And that's about the speed that it works. If it didn't work that fast, your body run out of proteins. They break down too fast. And so your body makes these proteins incredibly quickly and almost always accurately. Okay? And when they're not accurate, they get broken down and the body builds it up again. Okay? And this didn't show the proteins that help fold the amino acids. Both these videos I'm going to show you are simplified so that we can see what's going on. Actually, the process is much more complex than we see here. Okay, and so the DNA. The fascinating thing about DNA is that your DNA, your specific DNA, is in every cell in your body. Okay, your specific DNA is in every cell in your body. In your nerve cells, your muscle cells, your bone cells, your blood cells, all the different kind of cells, it's the same DNA. So that same DNA is able to tell a bone cell how to be a bone cell. It's able to tell a nerve cell how to be a nerve cell. It's able to tell a muscle cell how to be a muscle cell. It's able to tell all the 200 plus kinds of different cells in your body how to be the cell that they need to be. Okay, to me, that is just incredible. It's the same DNA, it's the same sequence in every cell. But the body knows how to take the information that's needed for that particular cell and make that cell work. Okay. Random processes don't explain the origin of DNA. Random processes don't explain the origin of highly complex system. But what I want to talk to you now about is reproduction. That to me is the most critical thing about living systems. If you think about it, right? What do living systems do that nothing else can do? They reproduce, right? If you couldn't reproduce, life doesn't work, right? I mean, life ends pretty quickly if we can't reproduce. And so reproduction is critical, but how easy is it? Okay. Let me just remind you of all the things that the body can do. All those are incredibly complicated, but I believe reproduction is the most complicated. Okay, and so we know that things don't make more than, this is not how you make a new car, right? Okay, this is not how new cars are made, right? They don't come out of the trunks of old cars, right? and so that's not how new cars, but if you're going to make a new person, you're going to need to make more DNA. And that means we need to copy the DNA, okay? All 3 billion letters of it, we need to copy, and we need to copy it correctly, okay? So if you need a new cell in your body, what has to happen? Your body has to copy your DNA so that there's a DNA for that new cell. And in order for there to be a new person, somehow that their DNA has to get into their system because of a copy from the mother and the father, okay? And so let me just show you real quickly how DNA is copied. Okay, this is how DNA is copied. This is from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, like the other video was. This is DNA coming in to the system. It's being split into the 2 strands. One strand's going this way, the other strand's going this way. Okay. This is the molecule, the enzyme that unwinds the 2 strands of DNA. It does it at about 10,000 RPM, about 2 or 3 times as fast as your car engine turns, okay? Incredibly fast. One strand goes this way, one strand goes this way. You remember I told you that the strands are headed in opposite directions? Well, this is the easy one strand over here. It's copied in the same direction as it's coming in, and it makes another copy of the DNA that way. But the other strand of DNA, it has to be turned around backwards, copied, and then fed back in. Okay, think about that for a minute. Watch these, when these loops come up again, I'll show you. But here's the simple one. Okay, it goes through the helicase, separates over here. It goes into what they call the DNA polymerase, what makes the new DNA strand. But this other one goes, it's looped around, it's fed back in backwards, copied backwards, and then spliced back in to the DNA strand. That's how the second strand is copied, okay? They call them Okazaki fragments, but that's the big loop there that you see, which is turned around backwards and copied. Can you imagine? And they're only showing you about 1/3 of the actual enzymes that are actually involved in this process so that you can actually see what's going on. But again, there it is. One strand going this way, the other one looped around. And look at all these enzymes that are making this loop right here. Look how coordinated all that is, right? They're all working together incredibly fast. And it's almost always exactly right. And then, oh, by the way, it's 3 billion times it's got to be right, okay, to make one DNA correctly, okay? And so I just wanted to help you understand that's what has to happen if you're going to make life. If you're going to make life from life, it's incredibly complicated. And it's even beyond, really beyond our understanding, okay, of what can be done. Okay. This verse comes to my mind every time I look at that video, okay? But Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible, okay? Without God, life on earth should be totally unexpected. Okay, there's no reason to believe that life could have come about by chance. There's no reason you'd expect to have any functional proteins. There's no reason to expect that DNA could be there, that information that's buried in the DNA could be there. And oh, by the way, the DNA is probably the most easily degraded molecule in your body. Actually, RNA is, but DNA is a close second. And so the molecules that carry all the information that we critically need, they're actually the most unstable. And your body actually has several enzyme systems that correct DNA mistakes all day long. Okay, now I want you to think about that for a minute. If you didn't have those enzyme systems in your body, you couldn't survive. Okay, because they correct a mutation in your DNA in every DNA molecule every day. Okay, and so how could life have evolved without these repair enzymes? Well, life couldn't have evolved. And so if you think about it, this is one of the most complicated, one of the most difficult things for evolution, is to explain how these repair enzymes evolved along with the DNA. Okay, it's incredibly hard to believe, but people do. And there's no reason to believe that life could do all these complicated things. But it's the hardest to believe that life could reproduce. Okay, and so I want you to just understand that. For me, life is powerful evidence of God's existence. Powerful evidence of God's existence. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. God's saying that, of course, we haven't known this about DNA for very long, but God is saying that all you got to do is look at a human body and say, nobody could have done that but God. And now that we know more about it, we understand even more how nobody could have done that except God. Okay? You are not an accident. We were all made by God in God's image, and we're all valuable to him. God has given us a purpose and a meaning for life. His law is written on our hearts, and we have a clear sense of right and wrong. But just to remind you, life is a precious gift from God. Life is a precious gift. I hope you understand how valuable life is and how special you've been made in God's image, okay? And that how we should do our best to protect life on this earth as best we can. Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate that. I'm glad to answer any questions that you have today. Anybody got any questions?
Okay, so let's ask short questions. Don't give the answers, okay? Let the man up here give the answers, okay? So who would like to ask a short question? Judy, you got something, I'm sure. I know. All right, in the back.
Can you give us just a word about the second law of thermodynamics?
Oh, my goodness. Okay. I specifically almost always avoid talking about the second law of thermodynamics, okay? The reason I do, well, okay, let me tell you, then I'll answer your question, okay? The reason I do is it's pretty complicated to understand, okay? But what it really tells us is that things degrade, okay, over time. There's a lot more to the second law of thermodynamics than that, okay? But in other words, one other thing, if there weren't the second law of thermodynamics, all the oxygen could be up in this corner of the room up here and we could all just suffocate, okay? But the second law of thermodynamics spreads out everything. Everything diffuses because of the second law of thermodynamics. But also, things go downhill, okay? And so that's another good reason as to why things don't build themselves up by accident, by evolution. Because, as I talked about these enzymes, these repair enzymes for DNA, they have to repair the damage being done because of the second law of thermodynamics. And so, yeah, second law of thermodynamics is very important, but the reason I don't talk about it normally is because it confuses people if I go into great detail about what it is. But just simply, it means that things degrade, that things go downhill over time, and that's what happens. And it's a well-known fact. And people, there are aspects of second law of thermodynamics that are important, like I was talking about with oxygen. It's important that oxygen is all the way through this room and not all stuck in one corner of the room. And so there are valuable things about the second law of thermodynamics. But the main thing for us as Christians to understand is that things break down, and if we think about that, we know that. Okay, we see that every day. Our houses don't get cleaner by accident, right? They get dirtier every day. And that's another effect of the second law of thermodynamics. Yeah.
Okay, another question. Wow, you've done a good job. I think you've answered
I've either
everybody's
gone way
questions.
over their heads or they understood it all. I'm not sure which. Okay. So
All right. You have anything else to share with us?
let's see. What else could I share with you today? I guess, just the information that I shared with you today, I think, is the most powerful evidence from organic chemistry, which is my field of expertise, from organic chemistry that there is. Next time, mainly because of these two things right here, okay? These two molecules, I go in the laboratory, I make both of them. Every time, every day. Can't even separate them without using another molecule like this to separate them. I can't even separate them. Can't make either one of them intentionally, okay, without starting with something that already has this property. And so to me, this really is the most powerful evidence at the heart. And it's critical because, as I showed you before my molecule fell apart, is that if your amino acids have the wrong configuration here, it has the wrong structure here, and it doesn't work. So it doesn't perform whatever it's supposed to perform in your body. And so, I mean, your hair is made of amino acids. Your muscles are made of amino acids. There are amino acids in your bones, even, and a lot of the structures in your body. Your blood vessels are made of amino acids, and so they have to be right. They have to be functional, and if they're not the right structure, they're not functional. And so, to me, this is just powerful evidence. And as I showed you, the scientific evidence is strongly in favor of creation. Strongly in favor of it. I mean, I showed you the chances of things happening by accident are zero. Okay, and so to me, I mean, for those of you in this room that are members of this church and here at a meeting like this, I'm sure that you're followers of Christ. That the large majority of you are, and that you have been a lot of your life. But I do want to encourage you. You know, you're probably looking at this like a lot of my audiences do, and are saying, well, of course. I mean, you know, what I presented to you is something that you would have expected, because you believe that God exists and you believe that God created all this. What I encourage you to remember is that your children and your grandchildren don't necessarily believe that, because that's not the world that they're growing up in, particularly your grandchildren, okay, and your great-grandchildren if you have any yet. That's not the world they're growing up in. That's not their mindset. And we need to help them to the extent that we can see that it's crazy to believe that they evolved by accident. It's just crazy. And so hopefully some of the evidence that I've showed you today might help you do that.